What happens when the cheapest person in the office secretly becomes the most powerful person in the industry? For months, I endured their mockery while filing a patent that would dismantle their corporate hierarchy from the inside out. They thought I was invisible until the acquisition papers hit their desks and forced them to beg me for their jobs. And before I tell you how it ended, I need you to understand how it started, because the ending only makes sense once you feel the years that built it. I grew up in a house where money was a language spoken in whispers in the back room after the kids were supposed to be asleep. My mother worked 2 jobs, one at a diner that smelled permanently of burnt toast, and one cleaning offices at night in buildings so tall, she used to say the elevators made her ears pop. My father left when I was young enough that I don't really remember his voice, only the sound of a door closing and the silence that followed it for years. I tell you this not for sympathy, but because it matters for what comes later. Because I learned early, in that small apartment, with the flickering porch light, that nobody was coming to hand me anything. If I wanted something, I had to build it myself, quietly, in the dark, while everyone else was asleep or too busy to notice. I was good with numbers before I was good with anything else. Not the flashy kind of good, not the kid who wins math competitions and gets his photo in the local paper. The quiet kind of good, the kind where you sit with a problem long after everyone else has given up, because giving up costs you nothing, and you had already decided a long time ago that giving up wasn't an option you could afford. I put myself through a state school on loans and grants, and a work-study job reshelving library books at 2 in the morning. And somewhere in those long, cold, fluorescent-lit nights, I fell in love with an idea. Not a person, not a hobby. An idea. The idea that data, if compressed and predicted correctly, could save companies staggering amounts of money, and that nobody serious was working on the specific angle I kept circling back to on napkins and the backs of old assignments. Nobody funded it. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the quiet engine underneath everything that happened later. I pitched it, timidly, twice in graduate seminars, to professors who nodded politely and moved on to the next student, the one with the connections, the one whose uncle sat on some advisory board somewhere. I applied to 2 small incubator programs and got form letter rejections both times. And somewhere in that rejection, something hardened in me. Not bitterness exactly, more like resolve with the edges sanded sharp. I decided I didn't need permission, I just needed access. And access, it turned out, could be bought cheaply, if you were willing to let people underestimate you while you took it. That's how I ended up at Halcyon Systems. I want you to picture the interview, because it tells you everything about the year that followed. I sat across from a hiring manager named Patricia, who barely looked up from my resume, who asked me exactly 4 questions in 11 minutes, and who offered me a salary so low I actually laughed out loud before catching myself. She didn't apologize for the number. She just said, "Well, we do have some very talented people already, so we're looking for someone who can just handle the technical back end without needing too much hand-holding." I remember the specific phrase she used. The technical back end, like I was a drawer you shoved things into and forgot about. I took the job anyway, because Halcyon held exclusive licensing access to a data architecture framework I needed to test my theory at scale, something I could never have afforded to license on my own. They thought they were hiring cheap labor. I knew I was buying myself a laboratory. The office itself deserves its own description, because environment shapes everything, and I want you to feel it the way I felt it every single morning walking in. Glass walls everywhere, the kind designed to look transparent and modern, but that actually just made everyone perform constantly, because you could always be watched, always be seen not quite working hard enough. The smell of the place was specific. Burnt coffee from a machine nobody ever cleaned, the plastic tang of new carpet that never seemed to stop smelling new, and underneath it all, faintly, the sour note of ambition gone slightly rotten. You could hear it too, if you listened. The particular cadence of people laughing at jokes that weren't funny, because the person telling them signed their paychecks. The clatter of expensive shoes on hard floors, a sound that always seemed to announce someone important before they'd even turned the corner. And my corner, my desk, sat under a light that buzzed audibly, an electrical stutter that no one from facilities ever quite managed to fix, as if the building itself had decided that corner didn't deserve full illumination. Derek Whitfield ran my department, and I need to describe him properly, because a story like this deserves a real villain, not a cartoon. Derek wasn't stupid. That's important. Stupid men are easy to outmaneuver because they don't see you coming even when you're standing right in front of them waving a flag. Derek was clever in the specific way that certain men in certain rooms are clever. Clever at reading a room. Clever at knowing exactly which compliment would loosen which client's wallet. Clever at making you feel, in the space of a single conversation, both flattered and small. He wore his confidence like it had been tailored for him at birth, and in a way, it had. Private school, a father who'd been a name partner somewhere, an easy fluency in the specific dialect of golf courses and steakhouse dinners that most of us, in that office, had never been taught to speak. He wasn't cruel in dramatic ways. He was cruel in small, constant ways, which I've come to believe is a far more corrosive kind of cruelty, because it never gives you a single moment dramatic enough to justify walking out. The phrase came early, not the first week. The first week, I was invisible in a neutral way, the way any new hire is invisible. It was the third week, in a meeting about server migration costs, when I offered a suggestion that would have saved the department almost $11,000 a quarter. And Derek looked at me the way you look at a vending machine that's just made a slightly unexpected sound and said, to the room, not to me. Interesting. Didn't expect that kind of insight from the budget hire. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Not cruel laughter, exactly, more the reflexive kind. The kind people do when the person with power in the room laughs first, and everyone else follows out of habit rather than agreement. And then the moment passed, the meeting moved on, and nobody remembered it except me. I remembered it because I felt something in my chest go very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. After that, the phrase followed me like a shadow I hadn't asked for. Let's check with the budget hire. He's good with the boring stuff. The budget hire can stay late, right? He doesn't have anywhere better to be. Always said with a smile, always delivered in that tone that made objecting seem humorless. Oversensitive, not a team player. I want to be honest with you about something. There were nights I sat in my car in the parking garage, engine off, hands on the wheel, just breathing, trying to talk myself out of the specific, quiet shame of being reduced to a discount label in front of a room full of people every single week. Shame is a strange thing. It doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like sitting perfectly still in a parked car for 20 minutes because you don't trust your own face to hold together for the drive home. There was one person in that office who was different, and I want to tell you about her. Because she's the reasons I didn't let the shame calcify into something that would have made me smaller instead of sharper. Her name was Priya, and she worked 2 desks down, in client relations, and she was one of the only people who ever pulled a chair up to my desk and actually asked me what I was working on. And then, this is the part that mattered, actually listened to the answer. She'd been at Halcyon 4 years, long enough to understand exactly how the hierarchy worked, and long enough to be quietly furious about it in a way she'd learned to keep mostly hidden, the way you learn to keep a limp hidden so people stop asking about the injury. She used to leave a coffee on my desk sometimes, wordlessly, on mornings after she'd overheard Derek being especially sharp with me. She never made a speech about it. She just quietly signaled, again and again, in small, unglamorous ways that she saw me, that the label didn't define what she thought I was worth. I want you to hold on to her, because she matters later, in a way I couldn't have predicted at the time. It was Priya, actually, who first noticed the pattern in my late nights. I told her, carefully, vaguely, that I was working on something personal, a project outside of work, nothing that overlapped with Halcyon's business. That last part was true as in letter but not quite in spirit, and I want to be honest about that tension, because I've thought about it a great deal since. I never touched Halcyon's servers for my own work. I never copied a line of their proprietary code. But I was, undeniably, using the intellectual environment I'd bought access to. The exposure to their data architecture, the patterns I absorbed simply by being present in those rooms, as raw material for something I was building in the stairwell, on my own laptop, on my own time. There's a version of this story where a lawyer picks that apart for hours. I'm not going to pretend the line was perfectly clean. I'm only going to tell you that I believed then, and believe now, That ideas built with your own hands, on your own time, from your own mind, belong to you, no matter how cheaply someone else has decided to value the person who built them. The stairwell became my second office. Halcyon's stairwell, between floors 4 and 5, had a landing with a window that looked out over the parking structure, and it was almost always empty, because everyone else took the elevator. Because walking anywhere in that building was apparently beneath people who golfed on weekends. I'd go there most lunch hours with my laptop and a granola bar, and I'd open a private folder, not stored on company cloud, not stored anywhere that could be traced back to Halcyon's infrastructure. And I would work. Predictive compression algorithms, modeling scenarios, testing edge cases against the kind of large, messy, real-world datasets that only a company like Halcyon had access to. Datasets I studied the shape and behavior of during work hours, and then, at night, on my own machine, built new architecture to compress more efficiently than anything currently on the market. I kept a second folders too, one I didn't fully understand the purpose until much later. Screenshots, meeting notes, emails where a suggestion I'd made in a Tuesday meeting turned up, almost verbatim, in a Friday email from someone else, someone whose last name matched a member of the leadership team. Timestamps. I wasn't building a legal case, not consciously, not yet. I think, if I'm honest, I was just trying to prove something to myself. That I wasn't imagining the pattern, that the walls of that place really were built the way I sensed them to be built. Favoritism dressed up as meritocracy, nepotism wearing a blazer. The nights got long. I want you to feel the specific exhaustion of that period, because it's not glamorous, it's not the montage version of hustles that gets romanticized. It's real, physical exhaustion, the kind where your eyes burn by 10 p.m., and you catch yourself reading the same line of code 4 times without absorbing it. And you have to decide, every single night, whether to push through or to sleep, knowing that pushing through meant another day running on fumes at a job that already made you feel like fumes were all you were worth. I lived on the kind of coffee that tastes like punishment. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. Priya noticed that too, and one night, finding me still at my desk at almost 9, she sat down across from me and said quietly, "Whatever you're building, it better be worth what it's costing you." I didn't answer her directly. I just said, "It will be." I believed it. Some nights, belief was the only fuel left in the tank. 11 months into this, 11 months of small cuts, of the budget hire label worn smooth from overuse, of stairwell nights and folders quietly filling with both code and evidence, came the Meridian account, and everything shifted. Meridian Logistics was Halcyon's largest client, a company so enormous that its logo alone seemed to make people in our office stand up straighter. Their contract renewal was coming due, and the entire department had been thrown, for weeks, into a scramble to produce a cost reduction proposal, impressive enough to keep them from shopping around. I'd been quietly feeding early, unpatented fragments of my compression framework into department-wide brainstorming sessions. Not because I was foolish enough to hand over the whole architecture, but because a partial demonstration, framed the right way, could prove the department's technical credibility without exposing the finished engine underneath. I told myself it was strategic generosity. I told myself I was still in control. I want you to picture the boardroom the day of the pitch, because I sat in the back, the way I always did, in the row of chairs reserved for people whose presence was required but whose opinions were not. Derek stood at the head of the table in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, gesturing at slides that used my language, my logic, my architecture, dressed up in his voice, his confidence, his easy charm. He called it our breakthrough approach. He said we so many times that by the end of the presentation, I genuinely wondered if he'd started to believe it himself. The Meridian executives leaned forward. Some actually applauded. Derek beamed like a man accepting an award he'd never trained for and never earned. And I sat there, in my cheap blazer, in my forgettable corner of the room, watching 11 months of stairwell nights get repackaged and sold under someone else's name for a bonus that would eclipse my entire annual salary. I didn't say anything in that room. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear, not exactly, it was arithmetic. I understood, with a clarity that almost scared me, that speaking up in that moment would accomplish nothing except giving Derek the chance to smooth it over, to say something like, "Of course the whole team contributed," and let the moment dissolve into vague, meaningless credit sharing that would change nothing about my salary, my title, or the way that room saw me. Some injuries you don't treat in the moment. You let them scar over, and you use the scar as a map for exactly where to strike later. That night, I stood outside the building in the cold and watched Derek climb into his black Mercedes with the vanity plates that read Winner Won. Watched him pull away laughing on his phone, probably already telling someone about his triumphant pitch, and something inside me that had been simmering for 11 months went very, very quiet. Not defeated quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before a decision that can't be undone. I went home and I didn't sleep. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg I'd never bothered to fix, and I opened both folders, the code and the evidence, side by side, and I asked myself the only question that mattered. Not how do I get revenge? Revenge is loud and cheap, and it burns out fast, leaving you with nothing but the smoke and the same empty bank account you started with. I asked myself something colder. How do I become something they cannot survive without, and then let the market do what corporate cowardice never would? Force them to kneel. The answer unfolded over the following weeks like a slow, deliberate unclenching of a fist I hadn't realized I'd been making for almost a year. First, I finished the framework. Truly finished it. Not the fragment Derek had paraded in front of Meridian, but the complete architecture, refined until the efficiency gains weren't a modest, sellable improvement, but something closer to a fundamental shift in how mid-size firms could think about data cost altogether. 78% reduction in cloud storage overhead under real-world load conditions. I tested it obsessively, the way you test something you know you'll only get one real chance to launch correctly. Second, I filed. I want to walk you through this part carefully, because it took nerve I didn't fully know I had. I found an intellectual property attorney 2 states away, someone with no connection to my industry circle, someone who wouldn't casually mention my name over drinks with people who might know Derek. I formed a private holding company, Resign Analytics, under a name deliberately generic enough that it wouldn't draw a second glance if anyone stumbled across it in a search. I filed a provisional patent under that entity, my name buried in filings that required a specific kind of digging to uncover. I paid the fees out of savings I'd been quietly building for exactly a moment like this one. Money I'd scraped together by living smaller than anyone in that office ever imagined, by driving a car with a check engine light I'd learned to ignore, by turning down every lunch invitations that would have cost me $12. I'd rather have invested in something that might, one day, buy the whole building. Third, and this is the part I think about most, because it required a kind of patience that felt almost unbearable. I reached out quietly, carefully, through encrypted channels and a burner email address, to 2 venture capital firms known for a very specific, very cold specialty, acquiring dormant, under-leveraged intellectual property before larger corporations even realized it existed on the market. I didn't pitch them a company. I pitched them leverage. I explained, in cautious, deliberately clinical language, that I held a patent-pending framework that a mid-size systems integrator was actively using, in a limited form, to service one of the largest logistics contracts in the region, and that the same integrator had no idea the underlying technology's true owner sat 2 floors below the executive suite, filing expense reports under a title that made grown men laugh in meetings. One of the 2 firms understood immediately what they were looking at. Within 3 weeks, we'd structured an acquisition vehicle, Ridgeline, backed now by real capital, positioned to acquire controlling interest in the specific technology vendor relationship that sat underneath Meridian's entire service agreement with Halcyon. I signed documents late at night, in my apartment above the laundromat, the dryers thumping rhythmically through the floor like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, but somehow matched the pace of my own. And through all of it, the filings, the calls, the trembling hand that signed documents worth more than every paycheck I'd ever received combined. I kept showing up to Halcyon at 8:55 every single morning. I kept letting Derek call me the budget hire in front of clients, in front of Priya, in front of a room full of people who would, in a matter of weeks, be desperately trying to remember whether they'd ever been kind to me. I kept my face soft, my voice quiet, my shoulders slightly stooped in that particular posture of a man who has already given up. Because that posture was armor, and I understood, with a clarity I still find almost frightening, that the moment they saw what I was building, the war would already be over. I needed them blind for just a little longer. Priya noticed something had changed. though she couldn't name it. One evening, near the end of that stretch, she caught me in the parking garage and said, "You look different lately. Lighter, almost. Did something happen?" And I remember smiling at her, a real smile, the first one I'd given anyone in that building in months, and saying, "Something's about to." She didn't push further. I think some part of her understood that whatever it wasn't hers to carry, not yet. The final piece clicked into place on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that gives no warning, no dramatic shift in the light, nothing to signal that the ground was about to move. Derek called an emergency meeting, his tie slightly crooked, his face already carrying the pale, damp look of a man who has just read something he doesn't fully understand but instinctively knows will cost him everything. He told the room that a mysterious holding company had acquired controlling interest in Meridian's primary technology vendor, the same framework Halcyon had built its biggest contract around, and that the acquisition triggered an immediate license renegotiation clause. He said legal had reviewed the paperwork and found a name attached to the underlying patent that nobody in the room recognized. He looked directly at me when he asked the room, "Does anyone know who the hell this person is?" He looked at me the way you look at a filing cabinet. Not out of suspicion, but out of the sheer habit of not seeing me at all. I raised my hand. The room went silent in a way it had never gone silent for me before. Not the polite, dismissive quiet reserved for a budget hire's unwelcome input, but a heavy, uncertain silence with an actual pulse to it. I stood up slowly, and I want you to understand what that motion cost me and what it gave back in equal measure, because for 11 months I had made myself smaller than I was. And standing up in that room felt like finally taking up the exact amount of space I had always been owed. "It's me," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "The holding company is mine, the patent is mine. The framework you presented to Meridian 8 months ago as your own breakthrough. I built that. Every line on my own time before any of you knew it existed." Derek let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the reflex of a man whose brain hadn't yet caught up to the danger closing in around him. "That's not possible," he said. "You're a systems analyst. You're..." "Stop." He stopped himself right before the word left his mouth again, right before budget hire could detonate in front of a room that had already started turning against him in real time. "Say it," I told him quietly. "Go ahead. I think everyone here has heard you say it enough times to finish the sentence for you." Nobody laughed. Nobody rushed to defend him. I watched two of his closest allies at that table suddenly find their laptops extremely interesting. I explained it plainly, without theatrics, because the facts alone were theatrical enough. Ridgeline Analytics, the entities controlled, had acquired majority interest in the vendor relationship underpinning Meridian's entire technology stack. That gave us leverage not just over licensing terms, but over the contract's future. And Meridian's board, upon learning the true origin of the framework their vendor had been quietly reselling as its own innovation, had already reached out to my legal team, not Halcyon's, to discuss the path forward. I could have stopped there and let the shock do the rest of the work, but I hadn't spent almost a year building patience just to cash it in for one dramatic afternoon. Over the following weeks, Ridgeline's leverage expanded from licensing renegotiation into board representation. First one seat, then two. Then enough influence to force the kind of structural reckoning that companies like Halcyon spend decades avoiding. Priya, when she found out the full scope of what had happened, didn't look betrayed the way I half expected. She looked, instead, like something had finally clicked into place for her too, like she'd always suspected the walls of that place were rotten. And now she finally had proof standing right in front of her, holding a folder she never knew existed. I want to walk you through the day everyone started calling the reckoning. Though I never used that word myself, because it always felt too theatrical for what was, at its core, a very simple correction. I walked back into that building wearing the same gray blazer I'd worn 100 unremarkable times before. Deliberately, because I wanted them to recognize me exactly as I was, not as some transformed, unrecognizable figure of power. I wanted them to understand that the person now holding leverage over their careers was the same person they'd walked past, without a nod for almost a year. We implemented the new structure quickly, because slow transitions only give frightened people time to build new alliances out of panic. Every role would now be evaluated on documented, measurable contribution, not tenure, not charm, not who had lunch with the right people on the right Fridays. Every project would carry a transparent ownership trail from that point forward, so credit could never again quietly migrate from the person who did the work to the person who happened to be standing at the podium. Compensation would follow output, not proximity to power. And for the first time in Halcyon's history, the engineers, the analysts, the people who used to eat lunch alone at their desks because they were just the technical staff, had a formal, structural voice in decisions that used to be made entirely behind closed doors they weren't even allowed to knock on. Then came the individual meetings. Pitch sessions. We called them internally, though everyone in that building understood exactly what they really were. Each former department head was asked to sit before a small panel, which now included 2 people from Ridgeline and, at my insistence, Priya, whose years of quiet observation had earned her a seat she'd never been offered before, and explain, plainly, what unique value they brought that the company genuinely could not replace. I watched people who had built entire careers on charm and inherited relationships suddenly discover they had almost nothing concrete to point to. One director spoke for nearly 15 minutes about vision and culture fit without naming a single measurable outcome. Another brought in printed graphs from 3 years prior. Numbers everyone in the room knew had been achieved primarily by people who no longer worked there. It wasn't cruel to watch. I want to be honest about that too. I felt no triumphant glee sitting through those meetings, only a kind of tired clarity. The specific exhaustion of watching a system finally show its true shape after years of being dressed up as something fairer than it ever actually was. Derek went last. I made sure of that, not out of cruelty, but because some part of me needed the full arc of that year to close in the same room where it had opened. He walked in wearing a suit that had clearly been chosen carefully, the kind of armor a man puts on when he already suspects the battle is lost, but refuses to admit it even to himself. His hands weren't steady. His voice cracked twice in the first 2 minutes. He talked about loyalty, about client relationships built over years, about institutional knowledge that couldn't simply be replaced. I let him speak for almost 10 full minutes without interrupting once, because I remembered, vividly, every single time he had cut me off mid-sentence in a meeting to let someone louder finish my thought for me. Every time my ideas had been absorbed into his voice without so much as a nod in my direction. When he finally finished, I asked him one question, the only question that had ever really mattered in that entire building. What did you build? I said. Not who did you know. Not whose relationships you inherited. What did you build, with your own hands, on your own time, that this company's genuinely could survive without? He didn't have an answer, because for years his entire value had been architecture constructed on other people's labor, specifically, in the end, on mine. I didn't fire him out of spite, and I want you to understand why. Because spite is a currency that feels satisfying for about 10 minutes, and then leaves you poorer than when you started. I offered him the same choice we offered everyone in that room. A lateral role, stripped of title and inflated authority, evaluated on the same measurable terms as everyone else from that point forward. Or a severance package generous enough that no reasonable person could call it unkind. He took the severance. I think some part of him already knew. He would never survive in a structure where results mattered more than the sound of his own voice in a meeting. In the months that followed, Halcyon didn't just survive the restructuring. It transformed into something almost unrecognizable from the place that had once made a grown adult feel small enough to sit in his car for 20 minutes just to compose his face before driving home. Priya moved into a leadership role she had earned quietly for years and been denied just as quietly. The framework, now fully commercialized under Ridgeline's license, became the backbone not just of Halcyon's operations but of 3 other firms in the industry who came to us, hats in hand, once word spread through the market about what the technology could actually do. I still keep that second folder, the one full of screenshots and timestamps, though I've never needed to use it the way I once feared I might. I keep it the way you keep an old photograph from a hard year. Not because you want to relive it, but because you never want to forget exactly how far you climbed out of it. Here's what I've come to understand, sitting where I sit now, running something built on the very framework they once dismissed as the work of just the budget hire. The most dangerous person in any room is rarely the loudest one. It isn't the person with the corner office, the inherited last name, or the confidence to speak over everyone else's sentences. It's the person everyone has quietly stopped watching. The one absorbing the insults, clocking the patterns, keeping their head low, building something real in the stairwells and kitchen tables of their lives, while everyone else is too busy performing importance to notice the ground shifting beneath their feet. We live in an economy now where value doesn't announce itself with cufflinks and vanity plates anymore. It compiles quietly, overnight, in a folder nobody thought to check, filed under a name nobody bothered to look up, funded by people who understand that real leverage doesn't need a title to be dangerous. And on one ordinary afternoon, it walks back into the room that once dismissed it, and asks a simple question that changes absolutely everything. What did you actually build? If there's one thing I hope you carry with you from everything I've just told you, it's this. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness, and never let anyone convince you that your overlooked years were wasted ones. The world doesn't always reward you the moment you deserve it. Sometimes it makes you wait far longer than feels fair, watching people who did less get more, absorbing a label that was never true but was repeated so often it started to feel like gravity. But if you keep building, quietly, patiently, with everything you have left after the humiliation and the long nights and the doubt that creeps in at 2 a.m, there comes a day when the people who once called you cheap will be the ones sitting across the table from you, hands shaking, trying to explain why they still deserve a seat that you, and only you, now control. Let them underestimate you. Just make sure that by the time they finally notice, you've already finished building the thing that makes underestimating you the single most expensive mistake of their lives.